Amber Creek gazed out the window of her home, the sun casting soft light over the neat suburban neighborhood. It was a picturesque morning, the kind that gave the illusion of a perfect life, the kind of life she thought she'd always have when she married Mark, her high school sweetheart. They had the house, the dog, and the future ahead of them. But beneath the surface, things were far from perfect. Amber's smile faltered as she turned away from the window. She watched Mark, sitting at the kitchen table, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He had been quiet for days, his eyes distant, the weight of something unspoken hanging between them. The sound of the coffee machine bubbling seemed too loud in the silence. Mark hadn't looked at her the way he used to for a long time. There was no spark, no laughter, just routine. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the worn tablecloth. There was a time when she believed that hard work and love could fix anything, but now it felt like they were both drowning in unspoken resentments. Their financial situation had worsened. The bills piled up, and Amber couldn't ignore the constant tension that simmered under the surface. She had tried to make things better, tried to keep the house spotless, tried to cook dinner every night, tried to keep Mark happy. But no matter what she did, it never felt like enough. He didn't seem to appreciate the effort, and that hurt more than anything. "You're quiet this morning," Mark said, breaking the silence, his voice low. He didn't look up from his cup. Amber forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just thinking," she said softly. Mark didn't respond, but she could feel his gaze on her. Amber's mind wandered to the days when they used to talk about everything. They'd planned their future together, but somewhere along the way, the dream had slipped out of reach. Amber wanted more. She wanted adventure, freedom, a life where she didn't feel shackled by their mounting debt. There was a nagging voice in her head, a whisper that told her she deserved more than this life. She had dreams of traveling, of experiencing new things, but Mark had always been content with the ordinary. He was comfortable in his routine, in the life they had built, even if it was falling apart beneath them. "Mark, we need to talk," Amber said, her voice shaking slightly. She could feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. She knew what she needed to say, but she was afraid of the consequences. Mark set down his cup and finally looked at her. "About what?" His expression was unreadable. "About everything," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "I don't think we can keep going like this. We're not happy anymore." Mark's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "What are you saying? Are you trying to say that you want to leave me?" Amber's heart raced. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. The words felt like they had slipped out on their own, a confession she wasn't ready to face. But deep down, she knew it was true. She didn't know how much longer she could pretend everything was fine. Their arguments had become more frequent, and the quiet resentment had been building for months. "I'm just saying, I don't think we're on the same page anymore," she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. "We want different things." Mark stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. "So that's it? You just give up?" His voice was tinged with anger now, a raw edge that made Amber flinch. "After everything we've been through, you just give up on me?" Amber's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected him to react this way. "I'm not giving up. I need more than this, Mark. I can't keep living like this." Mark's face twisted with frustration. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't see how unhappy you are? I'm doing the best I can. I'm just trying to keep us afloat." Amber's eyes welled up with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough. She had spent so many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering where it all went wrong. "I'm not asking for much. I just want to feel like I'm alive again," she whispered. Mark stopped pacing, his back to her. "You think you're the only one who feels trapped? You think I'm not struggling too?" The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Amber swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it impossible to speak. She wanted to tell him everything, to pour out all the emotions she had bottled up. But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped. Just like everything else in their relationship, she had to do something. She had to find a way out. But even as she thought about leaving, a part of her hesitated. She loved him, or at least she had once. But love was no longer enough to keep her in a life that made her feel like she was suffocating. "I think it's time for us to take a break," Amber said, her voice trembling. "I need to figure out what I want." Mark didn't reply. He just stood there staring at the floor, his body tense. The silence was deafening. Amber felt the weight of his unspoken words, the betrayal in the air. She had said it. She had opened the door, and now there was no going back. But in that moment, Amber realized something. She didn't just need space from Mark. She needed space from herself, from the life they had built together. She needed to find a way to break free, even if it meant walking away from everything she had known. Amber sat in the dimly lit living room, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence between her and Mark had stretched for hours, and it felt suffocating. She could feel the weight of the words that had been left unspoken, and now, in the dead of night, it seemed they were about to explode. She had tried to keep her emotions in check, to keep the peace, but everything inside her was ready to break. Mark was standing by the kitchen counter, his back to her, staring out the window. She watched him for a moment, the tension in his posture making her stomach twist. He had always been the quiet one, the type to bottle things up until he couldn't take it anymore. And tonight, it felt like that moment was approaching. "Mark," she began, her voice low but steady, "we need to talk." He didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge her. But she could tell he heard her. She could feel the sudden stillness in the air. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. "I don't think we can keep doing this," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can live like this, in this constant tension." Her words hung in the air, the heaviness of them settling between them like a cloud. She could feel her throat closing up, but she pushed on. "I feel like we're just existing, not living." Mark finally turned to face her, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. He took a step forward, closing the space between them, and the look in his eyes sent a chill through her. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice low, laced with something Amber couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, but there was a warning in it, something dark. "I'm saying," Amber hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair as if she could hold on to something, anything. "I'm saying that I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't think I can keep living in this house with this constant stress, this constant fight." Mark's face hardened, and the quiet rage in his eyes made Amber take a step back. She had never seen him like this before. Cold, detached, as if everything she said was a challenge to his very existence. "You want to leave?" His voice was suddenly louder, sharper. "Is that it? After everything we've been through, you just want to leave?" His words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper. Amber opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She hadn't meant to say it, not like this. She hadn't meant for it to get this far. But she couldn't take it anymore. The endless arguments, the mounting bills, the way everything seemed to be falling apart around them. The weight of it all was too much. "Don't you get it, Mark?" she finally managed to say, her voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending. I've tried so hard, but nothing changes. It's just you and me, stuck in this endless cycle of fighting, and I don't know if I can do it anymore." For a moment, the room was completely still. Mark's eyes were fixed on her, his breathing shallow as if he was trying to control something, to hold himself back from saying something he might regret. But then, without warning, he lunged toward her. "You think I'm the problem?" His voice was a growl now, harsh and raw. "You think I'm the one ruining this? You have no idea what it's like. I'm the one who's working my ass off, and you sit there complaining about everything." His words were coming faster now, more erratic. "You think I don't know what's happening? You think I don't see how miserable you are?" Amber took a step back, her heart racing in her chest. She had never seen him like this before. It was like a switch had been flipped, and now he was a stranger standing in front of her. "I don't want to fight anymore, Mark," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just want things to be different. I want a life where we're not constantly at each other's throats." Mark's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with barely contained anger. "You think this is easy for me? You think I'm happy?" He took a step forward, his eyes wild. "You're the one who's been pulling away, not me. You've been making this worse every single day, and now you want to leave?" The last sentence was shouted, echoing in the small room. Amber flinched, her heart thudding in her chest. She had never seen him like this, his rage so uncontrollable, so fierce. He was no longer the man she had married. This was someone else entirely. "Please," Amber whispered, holding up her hands, her palms facing him in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want this. I don't want to fight." But Mark wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were glazed, distant, as if the words didn't matter. He took another step toward her, closing the space between them, and Amber could feel the air around them thickening. "You're leaving me," Mark said slowly, his voice cold, almost calculating. "You're really going to leave me?" Amber opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Mark slammed his fist into the wall beside her. the sound of impact vibrating through the room. Amber gasped, stepping back in shock. "I'm not going to let you go," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're mine. You don't get to just walk away." The finality in his words sent a shiver down Amber's spine. She was trapped. Trapped in a life she couldn't escape, with a man who no longer seemed capable of loving her. The morning after the fight, Amber's absence was the kind of quiet that filled every corner of the house. Mark woke up to find her side of the bed cold, the covers tossed aside, and the air heavy with something he couldn't quite place. She was gone. It wasn't the first time they'd had a disagreement. They'd fought before, and sometimes Amber would go out for a walk or spend a day with her sister. But this time, there was no note, no message, nothing to explain where she had gone. It wasn't like her to just disappear. Mark sat up slowly, rubbing his temples, trying to remember the events of the night before. The rage, the yelling. His heart sank as he realized how far things had spiraled. He had raised his voice, struck the wall in anger, but surely Amber wouldn't leave over that, would she? He stood up, pacing the living room, looking out the window. The house was eerily still, and for a moment, he wondered if she had left him. It felt like an impossible thought, but the weight of it pressed down on him. He checked his phone. Nothing. No calls, no messages from Amber. She was usually good about keeping in touch, especially when things were tense. Mark's fingers shook as he dialed her number, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried again. And again. The same result. Mark's panic began to rise. Where was she? He couldn't believe she'd just walk away without a word. She was upset, sure, but she wasn't like that. She wouldn't leave without telling him. He had to find her. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, his heart pounding as he drove through the streets, calling her name in his mind. The weight of their argument hung over him, a constant reminder of how badly he'd treated her. Was she okay? Was she really gone? What if she had left for good? Hours passed and the sun began to set. The sense of unease only deepened. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He drove around for hours, searching the places she might have gone, even calling her friends and family. Everyone was as confused as he was. Amber hadn't been in touch with anyone. No one had seen her. She had simply vanished. At first, Mark tried to stay calm, telling himself she just needed space. But as the hours turned into a full day, doubt crept in. His mind raced. What if she was hurt? What if something happened to her? The police were called, and by the next morning, Amber was officially reported missing. A detective named Evans took charge of the case. Mark felt a growing pit in his stomach as he answered questions, trying to recall any detail that might help them find her. Detective Evans was methodical, asking about their relationship, their finances, their recent arguments. Mark answered the questions, his mind spinning. Yes, they had been having problems. Yes, Amber had expressed frustration, but nothing that seemed to justify her disappearance. "We'll find her, Mr. Creek," Detective Evans said, his tone calm but firm. "We're going to need you to stay available for questioning. Is there anyone who might have seen her? Anyone who might know where she went?" Mark felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He told the detective about Amber's sister, Sarah, and some of their friends. He didn't mention the fight, the one that had felt like a breaking point. He didn't know why, but it seemed like something too private to share with a stranger. The detective nodded and made a note. After the detective left, Mark stood alone in the living room, staring at the phone in his hand. He had called Amber's number again, and again there was no answer. His mind spiraled, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. How could she just disappear without a trace? He walked through the house, each room a reminder of their life together. The photos on the walls, the little things they had built over the years. All of it felt like a memory, like something distant and unreachable now. Had he lost her forever? His phone buzzed. A message from Amber's sister, Sarah. "Any news? Have you heard from her?" Mark's fingers trembled as he typed a reply, the words feeling empty, hollow. "No, nothing. I'm scared, Sarah. I don't know where she is." Sarah didn't respond right away. Mark stared at the screen, waiting for something, anything, that would tell him where Amber had gone, what had happened. But the phone remained silent. The unanswered questions hung in the air, thick and oppressive. What if Amber had left because of him? What if she was gone, not because of a temporary fight, but because she finally saw no way out? The thought hit him like a slap. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The weight of his actions, the things they'd said, the way things had gotten worse. Was this the consequence of all their unresolved tensions? Mark felt a knot in his chest tighten. Was this his fault? He spent the night restless, pacing, waiting for a call, a message, some sign of Amber, but the silence remained. The call came just as Mark was about to lose himself to another night of restless searching. The voice on the other end of the line was flat, professional, yet Mark could feel the weight of what was coming. "Mr. Creek, this is Detective Evans. We've found her." Mark's heart skipped a beat, hope and dread twisting together. "Where is she? Is she okay? Please tell me she's all right." There was a long pause before the detective spoke again. "I'm afraid she's not okay. We found Amber. She's been found dead, Mr. Creek. We need you to come to the scene immediately." The air seemed to leave Mark's lungs. His grip tightened on the phone, and for a moment, his world felt suspended in time. "What? No, no, that can't be." "Please, Mr. Creek," Evans cut in, his voice firm but sympathetic. "We need you here. It's urgent." Mark stood frozen, his mind racing. He couldn't make sense of it. He had spent the last 2 days hoping against hope that Amber was just upset, that she had gone away to clear her head. But now, the unthinkable had happened. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process the words. The detective's voice broke through his daze. "Mr. Creek, do you understand? We need you here now." "I'll be there," Mark choked out, his words almost lost in the silence. He hung up the phone, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he moved. He grabbed his coat, not knowing how his legs were carrying him. He couldn't shake the cold dread creeping through his veins. Amber, dead? By the time Mark arrived at the scene, the air was thick with the scent of pine trees, and the night had fallen dark, casting long shadows over the secluded area in the forest. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, blocking off the scene. Officers were milling about, some talking quietly among themselves, others focused on the perimeter. Mark approached Detective Evans, who was standing near the body, his face grim. He didn't have to ask. The look on Evans's face told him everything he needed to know. "She's here, Mr. Creek," Evans said quietly, gesturing toward the clearing. "We found Amber." Mark's stomach churned. His legs felt unsteady as he followed the detective, the air growing colder with every step. And then, he saw it. Amber's body, cold and lifeless, was partially hidden beneath a layer of plastic. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. His breath caught, and for a moment he couldn't move. She was lying face down, her body wrapped tightly in a plastic sheet, held together by what looked like strips of duct tape. The scene was more brutal than Mark had ever imagined. The terror, the confusion that had gripped him over the last few days now intensified with the reality before him. The detective stepped forward. "She's been here a while," Evans said softly, crouching beside the body. "It's hard to tell exactly, but the condition suggests it's been at least a few days." Mark wanted to speak, wanted to ask why, but no words came. He could barely breathe, his chest tight as he looked at Amber's still figure, the woman he had once known so well, now reduced to nothing more than a cold, tragic image in front of him. "We found no signs of struggle," Evans continued, "but we'll have to wait for the full forensic report to know more. But Mr. Creek, we'll need to talk to you about what happened. You were the last one to see her." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "She was just here. I didn't do this. I didn't—" The words caught in his throat, and he was unable to finish his sentence. The reality was too much to bear. He had just spoken to her hours before she vanished, their conversation filled with the heat of their argument. Yet now, she was gone, and he couldn't comprehend how it had all spiraled into this. Evans studied him carefully, eyes narrowing as he took in Mark's demeanor. The detective had seen enough to recognize the signs of panic and grief, but there was something in Mark's eyes, something that didn't sit right. The detective's gut told him that there was more to the story than just a sudden disappearance. "We'll take care of the details here," Evans said, standing up. "But Mr. Creek, I need you to come down to the station. We'll have more questions for you." Mark didn't respond right away. His mind was spinning, each thought clashing with the next. Amber, his wife, was gone, and he was left with nothing but an empty space where once their lives had been intertwined. As the detectives continued their work, Mark stood there, staring at Amber's body, lost in the overwhelming weight of the moment. The last few days, the arguments, the pain, they all seemed so small now in the face of this raw, brutal reality. He couldn't help but wonder, had he caused this? Was this the inevitable outcome of all the tension, the financial struggles, the broken promises? Could he have stopped it? But as he stood there, Unable to move, the one thing that gnawed at him more than anything else was the question that had no answer. Why? The days after Amber's body was found blurred into one long stretch of unease. Mark couldn't escape the thought that somehow, this had been his doing. Even the police, though polite, had started to look at him with suspicion. His story, the one he had repeated 100 times, was beginning to crumble. They were asking more questions now. The questions weren't just about where Amber had gone or what had happened. They were now about the things he had been hiding. Detective Evans sat across from Mark at the police station, flipping through a thick stack of financial documents. Mark felt the room closing in, the walls pressing against him as if they too were questioning his every move. "We found something interesting," Evans said, glancing up from the papers. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "You've been hiding a lot from your wife, Mr. Creek. This isn't just a little credit card debt." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his palms sweating. He hadn't expected them to dig this deep. Didn't think they would find the hidden accounts, the loans, the maxed-out credit cards. "I didn't mean for any of it to get this bad," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It just piled up. Amber didn't understand how hard I was working to fix things." Evans didn't respond immediately. He just flipped through a few more pages, his eyes scanning the details of the documents with practiced precision. "You were struggling, Mr. Creek. But Amber wasn't blind. She knew about the financial strain. You were hiding things from her, weren't you? You've been lying to her about where the money was going." Mark stared at the table, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. He didn't know how to explain himself, didn't know how to tell them that the debts, the secret loans, had been his last attempt to fix everything. Amber had been so unhappy, and he couldn't stand seeing her like that. He thought if he could just get ahead, everything would fall into place. He remembered the fights they'd had over money, the days when she would ask where the bills had gone, why they couldn't pay off their debts. He had told her they were managing, that they would figure it out. But he knew deep down they were barely staying afloat. He had taken out loans without telling her, hoping for a miracle that never came. "I was trying to fix things," Mark said finally, his voice breaking. "She wanted more, and I just couldn't give it to her. I thought if I could fix it, if I could just make enough money, she'd stop complaining. She wouldn't be so unhappy." Evans set the papers down, his gaze locking onto Mark's. She wanted more, sure. But more than that, she wanted a partner she could trust, someone who wasn't hiding things from her, someone who wasn't drowning in lies. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The detective's words stung, sharper than any accusation. He had failed her. He had thought his way out of it, tried to lie his way out of their problems. But now Amber was gone, and all the things he had kept hidden, all the debts, all the lies, seemed to weigh him down like 1,000 pounds. "You were in deep," Evans continued, his voice softer now, but no less pointed. "And Amber knew that. You might not have thought it, but she was smart. She saw the signs. She was unhappy, Mr. Creek. She wasn't just upset about the money. She was upset because she felt like she was living a lie." Mark's stomach churned. He had never been a dishonest man. At least, he hadn't thought of himself that way. But the lies had piled up, one after another, and now they were staring him in the face. Amber hadn't just disappeared because of one argument. She had left because she saw the truth, because she realized that the man she had married wasn't the person he said he was, and Mark, in his desperation to fix everything, had pushed her away. "You were drowning in debt, Mr. Creek," Evans said, his tone now a little more sympathetic. "But that's not what killed Amber, is it? It wasn't the money. It was the fear of losing her, the fear of everything falling apart." Mark's head snapped up, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The anger in their last fight hadn't been just about money. It had been about something deeper, about control, about trust, about the terror of losing everything. Amber had been right to leave him, and he had known it all along, even if he couldn't admit it to himself. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered, his voice raw. "I just wanted to make it better. I never thought—" His voice faltered, and he couldn't finish the sentence. Evans sat back, observing him for a long moment as if weighing something. "You didn't think, Mark. That's the problem." The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of the truth. Mark couldn't escape it, couldn't run from the reality that everything, his marriage, his life, had been built on lies. And now, it was all falling apart. The silence was deafening, and the realization of his own guilt hung over him like a storm. The days following Amber's discovery had been a blur of questions, police interviews, and sleepless nights. Mark couldn't escape the growing knot in his stomach, the suffocating anxiety that came with each passing hour. The investigation was becoming more intense, and now the walls seemed to close in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was slowly but surely closing in. Detective Evans had been thorough, more thorough than Mark could have ever anticipated. The initial questions had seemed routine, but the deeper the detective dug into their finances, the more Mark's world began to unravel. It was clear that Evans wasn't interested in surface-level answers. He wanted the truth. One afternoon, nearly a week after Amber's body was found, Mark received another call from Detective Evans. The voice on the other end was colder than usual, more clinical. "Mr. Creek," Evans began, "we've received the results from the forensic lab. I need you to come down to the station." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he sat down, trying to steady his breath. He had been expecting this moment for days, but he still wasn't ready for it. "What's the news?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "We have DNA evidence," Evans said. "It's conclusive." Mark's stomach dropped. His mind raced through 1,000 different thoughts, none of them making sense. "DNA?" He could barely grasp the significance of the words. "What do you mean?" "Mark, we have DNA from the crime scene, and it's a match. It's yours," Evans replied, his voice unwavering. A cold wave of realization swept over him, and for a moment Mark couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin, the walls pressing in on him. He hadn't expected it to come to this. Didn't think they would find anything so definitive. What are you talking about?" Mark stammered, his voice rising with panic. "There must be some mistake. I didn't do it. I didn't kill her." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Evans finally spoke again, his tone no longer compassionate, but stern. "Mark, the DNA we found on Amber's body matches yours. Your blood was on her clothes. We have enough evidence to press charges." The words hit him like a freight train. He had been denying everything for days, trying to convince himself that maybe it was just a terrible misunderstanding. But now the truth was undeniable. I didn't mean to." Mark's voice faltered. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He wanted to explain himself, wanted to say something that made sense, but he couldn't. He felt trapped. "Mark," Evans continued, "the evidence is clear. Your DNA is on Amber. You were there." Mark couldn't deny it. The pieces were falling into place now. He could hear his heart racing in his chest. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as he clutched the phone tighter, almost as though it could hold him together. He had tried to keep the truth buried, tried to push it out of his mind, but now it was all crashing down. There had been the argument, the last night they'd spent together. He remembered the rage, the desperation in his chest, the way Amber's words had hit him like a slap to the face. She had wanted to leave him, to break free from the suffocating life they had created. He hadn't been able to take it. The thought of losing her, of everything falling apart, had driven him to a breaking point. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but he had. He had pushed her too far. He had snapped. "I didn't want this," Mark whispered, the truth finally sinking in. He felt a wave of guilt crash over him, overwhelming him, drowning him in the weight of his actions. Detective Evans's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "Mark, I need you to come down to the station. We'll need to discuss this further. But understand this, the DNA evidence leaves no room for doubt." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. His chest tightened with the weight of what had happened, what he had done. There was no going back now. The police had everything they needed. His lies, his excuses, they all meant nothing now. I'll be there," he said quietly, his voice trembling. He hung up the phone slowly, his hands shaking. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing against his chest, suffocating him. He had never imagined his life would come to this moment, where everything he had built, everything he had tried to hold on to, would fall apart in an instant. Mark stood up, his legs weak beneath him. The gravity of what he had done hit him all at once, and he felt the full weight of his guilt crash over him. There was no escaping it. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Amber's death had been the result of his own failure to control his anger, his desperation to hold on to a life that had been slipping through his fingers. He had destroyed everything, and now the consequences were coming for him. Mark sat in the small interrogation room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The walls felt like they were closing in, and his chest tightened with every passing second. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. He was alone, but the weight of his actions surrounded him like a storm. His mind raced, each thought crashing into the next with no space for clarity. Amber, her face, her voice, the way she had looked at him during their last argument flashed before his eyes. She had been right to leave him. He had known it in that moment, and yet he couldn't control the anger that had boiled over. The police had made it clear. The DNA evidence left no room for doubt. He had killed her. The realization was brutal, a crushing blow that left him hollow. How had it come to this? How had the life he had built crumbled in such a short span of time? Mark squeezed his eyes shut, the memories swirling around him, each one more painful than the last. He had always prided himself on being a good husband, on being someone who could take care of his family. But all the lies, all the secrets he had hidden from Amber were now laid bare. The financial troubles, the constant pressure to keep up appearances, the unspoken tension, it had all led to this point. There was a knock at the door, and Detective Evans entered, his face unreadable. Mark didn't look up. He couldn't. The detective pulled out a chair and sat across from him, not bothering to say anything at first. Mark could feel Evans's gaze on him, the quiet judgment that seemed to weigh on his very soul. "We've been going over everything, Mark," Evans finally said, his voice calm but firm. "We have the DNA, we have the evidence, and we have your confession. But I still don't understand. You say you didn't mean to do it, but you were there. You were the last person to see her alive." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? What could he possibly say to explain the depth of what he had done? He hadn't meant to kill her. He hadn't. He had just lost control. He had felt cornered, desperate, and in that moment everything had spiraled out of control. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. I just wanted her to stay. I wanted everything to be okay. I didn't know what else to do. The money, the pressure, it was all too much. She kept pushing me. She wanted to leave, and I couldn't let her." Evans leaned back in his chair, watching Mark carefully. "So, you killed her because she wanted to leave? Because of the money?" Mark's eyes welled up with tears, but he didn't wipe them away. He couldn't. The weight of the truth crushed him. "I couldn't lose her. I couldn't bear the thought of her walking out, of her leaving me with nothing, everything I had worked for. It was all slipping away, and I couldn't stop it." The detective's face softened, but only for a moment. "You could have stopped, Mark. You could have walked away, talked it through, but instead, you chose to hurt her, to take her life." Mark's head dropped into his hands. His chest heaved with the weight of what he had done, and he couldn't stop the sobs that racked his body. He felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. There was no coming back from this. Amber was gone, and it was his fault. "I never thought it would come to this," Mark said between sobs. "I never thought she would be gone. I never meant for it to happen." Evans remained silent, allowing the gravity of Mark's words to sink in. The detective had seen his share of confessions, but there was something about this one that was different. Mark wasn't just confessing to a crime. He was confessing to the unraveling of his entire life. The guilt, the shame, the regret, it all poured out in that moment, and Evans knew that Mark was lost in his own self-destruction. "Do you realize the consequences of what you've done?" Evans asked, his voice calm but piercing. "Amber is dead, and there's nothing you can do to bring her back. Not now, not ever." Mark nodded slowly, his face pale, his body shaking with the force of his emotions. I know. I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't." Evans stood up, his chair scraping across the floor. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked at Mark with a mix of empathy and resignation. He had heard all the apologies, all the regrets, but the truth was, none of it mattered now. The damage had been done. "We'll have more questions for you later," Evans said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "But for now, I think you've said enough." As the detective turned to leave, Mark sat there, broken. He had lost everything. Amber was gone, and with her went any chance of redemption. There was no turning back. All he had left now were the consequences of his actions, the realization that nothing could ever fill the empty space inside him. Mark sat in the sterile, white-walled interrogation room, his hands trembling on the edge of the metal table. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above did nothing to ease the suffocating silence. It had been days since Amber's body had been found. Days since the DNA evidence had revealed his role in her death. But here in this cold, isolated room, it felt like time was standing still. His mind raced, replaying the events over and over again. The argument, the rage, the desperation that had taken control of him. He never intended for any of it to happen. He never intended to kill her. but the words, the pain of hearing her say she wanted to leave, had pushed him too far. He had tried to hold on to something, anything, before it slipped away for good. Detective Evans entered, his footsteps sharp against the floor. The man had a calm, methodical presence that only added to Mark's sense of dread. Evans sat across from him, folding his arms, his gaze fixed on Mark with quiet intensity. "I'm not here to make this harder for you," Evans said, his voice even. "But I need to hear it from you, Mark. I need you to tell me what happened." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had been avoiding the truth, pretending it wasn't his fault, that it was all some terrible misunderstanding. But deep down he knew. He knew the truth, and now there was no way to escape it. He took a shaky breath. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Mark began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want her to go. I didn't want to lose her." Evans leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "But you did lose her, didn't you? And now she's dead. So what happened, Mark?" Mark's chest tightened, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. He could feel the words building up, threatening to spill out, and he finally let them. "She was going to leave me. She told me she couldn't do it anymore. The arguments, the money, everything. I couldn't take it." His hands shook as he clutched the edge of the table. "She was right. I had failed her. I couldn't fix it. And I didn't know how to make her stay. I just snapped." Evans studied him, his expression unreadable. "So you killed her because she wanted to leave? Because you couldn't handle it?" Mark's eyes welled up with tears, but he didn't look away. He had to say it. He had to admit what he had done. "I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered. "I didn't know what I was doing. I couldn't lose her. I couldn't let her go. I just wanted everything to stop, to go back to the way it was before everything fell apart." The silence in the room was suffocating. Mark's confession hung in the air, thick with the weight of his own guilt. The detective didn't speak for a long while, letting the truth settle between them. Mark could feel the crushing reality of his actions taking hold of him. He had taken Amber's life because he was too afraid to face the truth. "I thought if I could just hold on to her just for a little longer, things would get better," Mark continued, his voice shaking now. "But I couldn't. I couldn't fix it. She was so unhappy. I was failing her in every way. I thought if I just stopped her from leaving, she'd stay, and everything would be okay." Evans exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving Mark. "You thought that, but you couldn't stop it. And now, here we are." Mark closed his eyes, trying to block out the image of Amber's lifeless body. He couldn't escape it. He would never be able to escape it. "I didn't want her to leave. I didn't want to be alone. I couldn't stand the thought of losing everything." The confession was out now, the dam broken. The guilt weighed heavily on Mark's shoulders, and the reality of what he had done hit him with a force he couldn't ignore. Amber, the woman he had promised to love and protect, was gone, and it was his fault. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Mark whispered, the words barely audible. "I just didn't know what else to do." Evans sat back in his chair, taking it all in. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he let Mark sit in the heavy silence, the weight of his words hanging in the room. It wasn't empathy that the detective was showing. It was simply the quiet acknowledgement that Mark had finally faced the truth, no matter how painful it was. "You'll have to face the consequences of your actions," Evans said quietly. "There's no undoing what's been done, but this is the first step, admitting it." Mark nodded slowly, his face pale, his eyes hollow with the realization that there was no escape. He had confessed. The truth was out, and it would be his burden to carry for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Detective Evans didn't respond. He simply stood up, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. "We'll be in touch, Mark. For now, you can rest here. We'll continue with the paperwork." As Evans walked out, Mark remained in his chair, staring at the table, his hands clenched into fists. The confession was done, the truth was out. But it felt like nothing would ever be the same again. The courthouse was a maze of cold stone, bustling with the shuffle of lawyers, witnesses, and spectators. Mark sat in the defendant's chair, hands trembling in his lap. His suit felt too tight, the weight of the proceedings pressing down on him. The room was filled with faces, some familiar, some strangers, but all of them were watching him, waiting for something. The walls seemed to close in as he sat there, his stomach a knot of anxiety. The trial had begun, and now everything was out in the open. The evidence, his confession, the shattered remnants of his life, all of it was being laid bare in front of him. He glanced toward the prosecution table, where the prosecutor sat with a calm, methodical demeanor. The prosecutor's eyes met Mark's for a brief moment, cold and calculating. Mark looked away, unable to hold the stare. He knew what was coming. The courtroom was quiet as the judge entered, his robe sweeping the floor. The bailiff called the court to order and the judge took his seat, his gavel striking the wood with an authority that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. It was real now. No more denials, no more hiding. The trial was starting, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, standing up and addressing the room. "Today, you will hear the tragic story of Amber Creek, a woman who was brutally taken from her family by the very person who should have protected her, her husband, Mark Creek." Mark flinched at the words, the weight of them sinking deep into his chest. Amber was gone, and he had killed her. He had never imagined it would come to this, that his life would end in a courtroom with strangers staring at him, judging him for his actions. The prosecutor continued outlining the details of the case: Amber's disappearance, the discovery of her body, the evidence, and Mark's confession. It was all there, all of it laid out for the world to see. Mark could barely bring himself to listen. Every word was a reminder of the darkness he had allowed to consume him, of the choices he had made that had led to this moment. The defendant, Mark Creek, will try to claim that this was a crime of passion, that he was overwhelmed by the pressures of life. But the truth is, he had a choice. He could have walked away, he could have sought help, but instead, he chose to take Amber's life, the prosecutor said, his voice firm, his gaze never leaving Mark. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the accusation hanging in the air. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes were fixed on the prosecutor, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the events that had led to Amber's death. He could still hear her voice, the final words she had said to him before everything fell apart. She had wanted to leave. She had been unhappy, and he couldn't stand it. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. He had tried to hold on, tried to force her to stay. And then it had all gone wrong. Amber was a woman with dreams, the prosecutor continued. A woman who wanted a better life, a life free from the constant fighting, from the secrets, from the fear. But her husband, Mark Creek, chose to take that life away from her. He took it in the most brutal way. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the prosecutor spoke. Each word was like a hammer striking him, driving home the reality of what he had done. The images of Amber lying there, her body cold and lifeless, flashed through his mind. He could still feel the rush of panic, the desperation that had taken over him in that moment. But it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered now except the consequences. The defense will argue that this was an accident, that Mark Creek was overcome with emotion and did not intend to kill his wife. But the truth is, his actions were deliberate. He planned this, he carried it out, and now he must face the consequences. The prosecutor sat down, his gaze briefly lingering on Mark before he turned to the jury. Mark felt their eyes on him, every one of them judging him. He could feel the weight of their stares, the pressure of their judgment, and it made his skin crawl. He looked down at his hands, his fingers twisted together in his lap. He could still feel the tremor in them, the remnants of the guilt that had been eating away at him since that night. He had confessed, yes, but that didn't make it any easier. The truth didn't make the pain go away. It didn't bring Amber back. The defense attorney stood, a sharp contrast to the prosecutor. Where the prosecutor had been forceful and unyielding, the defense attorney was calm, almost sympathetic. He addressed the jury, speaking in measured tones. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney said, "what we are not denying is that Amber Creek is dead, but what we ask you to consider is the man who stands before you today. Mark Creek is not a monster. He is a man who, under overwhelming pressure, made a terrible mistake, a mistake he will live with for the rest of his life." The defense attorney paused, looking at Mark for a brief moment. What happened that night was not premeditated. It was a crime of passion, driven by fear and desperation. Mark Creek did not set out to kill his wife, but he did, and now he must face the consequences. Mark didn't know whether to feel relieved or frustrated. The defense attorney was painting him as a victim of circumstance, as someone who had been pushed to the edge. It wasn't the truth, but it was what Mark had hoped for. Some shred of mercy, some way to escape the full weight of his actions. But he knew better. The truth was undeniable. The prosecutor's words echoed in his mind, and Mark knew there was no escaping it. The truth was simple. He had killed Amber, and now he would have to face the consequences. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the jury filed back into their seats. Mark sat motionless in the defendant's chair, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The silence felt heavier than it ever had before, as though the weight of the entire trial had culminated in this single moment. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one stretching out longer than the last. He felt his heart race in his chest. The judge's cold, impartial gaze swept over the room. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. His gavel struck the wood with a sharp sound that echoed through the room, calling the court to order. Mark could feel the eyes of the gallery on him, the stares of the jurors, the whispers from the family members who sat quietly, waiting for the inevitable. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice steady. The jury foreman, a woman with short-cropped hair, stood up slowly. She held a piece of paper in her hand, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. His heart beat wildly as he tried to steady himself. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman replied, her voice clear but firm. "We have reached a verdict." The entire room seemed to lean in, as if everyone was waiting for the same moment, for the same answer. Mark's pulse raced, his body stiff with dread. He could feel the sweat on his palms, his fingers digging into the fabric of his trousers. The judge nodded and turned toward the foreman. "Please, read the verdict." The room fell silent as the foreman unwrapped the paper, her eyes scanning the words. She looked up at the jury, then back at the judge, before speaking the words that seemed to echo in Mark's mind. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Creek, guilty of first-degree murder." The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. Mark's vision blurred for a moment, his body going cold as the reality of the verdict hit him. He couldn't move. His mind was spinning, reeling, but his body refused to respond. He had heard it, hadn't he? Guilty. The word was heavy, final, and it was his. Mark's breathing grew shallow as he struggled to maintain some semblance of control. The noise in the room grew louder, gasps, murmurs from the gallery, the shuffle of feet as people shifted in their seats. He could hear nothing but the pounding of his own heart, the rushing sound in his ears. The voices around him became distant, far away. His lawyer, who had been sitting beside him for the entirety of the trial, placed a hand on his shoulder, offering no words, just a firm touch. Mark barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on the floor, on his hands, as if they held the answer to everything. The judge's voice broke through the haze. "Mark Creek, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of your wife, Amber Creek. You will be sentenced at a later date." The room began to move around him, the proceedings continuing, but Mark was frozen. He barely heard the judge's words, or the statements being read. His thoughts were scattered, but all of them centered on one thing: Amber. She was gone, and he had killed her. The reality of what he had done settled deeper in his chest. He had confessed. He had admitted to it, but hearing it from the jury, hearing it declared in front of everyone, made it real in a way he hadn't been prepared for. The gallery had become a blur of faces. Amber's family sat behind the prosecution, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. He could see her mother, tears streaking down her face. Her father looked straight ahead, his expression unreadable, but there was no doubt in Mark's mind what that look meant. Justice had been served, but it came at a price. He could feel the weight of their stares, their silent judgment. The guilt in Mark's chest felt heavier than ever, suffocating him, and he couldn't escape it. There was no forgiveness for what he had done, no coming back from this. Amber was gone, and it was his fault. "Mark Creek," the judge said again, his voice unyielding, "you will be remanded into custody until sentencing. You may be escorted out." Mark didn't resist as the officers came to escort him from the courtroom. His legs felt like lead, his steps heavy as they led him out the door. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The finality of the verdict was all-consuming. The weight of it pressed down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. As he walked down the hallway, his mind wandered back to the days before Amber's death. The arguments, the lies, the debt, the unbearable pressure that had built up inside him, pushing him to the breaking point. None of it excused what he had done. There was no excuse for what had happened to her. He had killed her in a moment of desperation, of fear, and now the consequences were clear. He was going to pay for it. The doors to the holding cell slammed shut behind him, and Mark sank into the chair, his body exhausted, his mind reeling. The verdict was in, and there was no way out. The days in the prison cell felt endless, the harsh clang of the door shutting behind him marking the beginning of a new, unbearable reality. Mark sat on the small cot, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. His hands were still shaking, and every time his mind wandered back to the courtroom, to the verdict, the weight of what he had done crushed him all over again. He had been convicted. It was final. He was a murderer. The word echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls of his thoughts like a painful, unrelenting drumbeat. Amber was gone, and he was the one who had taken her life. In the days following the trial, Mark had been alone with his thoughts, unable to escape the crushing guilt. He had tried to block it out, tried to ignore the consequences of his actions, but it was impossible. Every moment of every day was a reminder of what he had done. Every face he saw in the yard, every guard who passed by, every inmate who whispered about him behind his back. It all felt like the walls of his own personal prison closing in tighter and tighter. The guilt was suffocating, and there were no words of comfort, no words of solace to ease the pain. He had known, deep down, that this was coming. The truth was undeniable. He had killed Amber, and now he had to live with the consequences. But what Mark hadn't been prepared for was the isolation. His own mind was his only company now, and it was a terrifying place to be. He couldn't escape it. The memory of Amber's face, the look of hurt in her eyes was seared into his brain. Her voice, the way she had begged him to listen, to stop, haunted him every second of the day. "I didn't mean it," he whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt you." But the words were empty. They didn't change anything. They didn't bring her back. Every night as he lay on the cot, staring at the dim light filtering through the bars of his cell, Mark found himself replaying the night of the murder over and over in his mind. He remembered the fight, the harsh words, the frustration boiling inside him, the way Amber had looked at him in that moment. She had been scared. She had been afraid of him, of what he might do. And in that moment of rage, he had hurt her. He had taken everything from her. The worst part was, he had known it at the time. He had known deep down that what he was doing was wrong, but the anger, the frustration, the overwhelming fear of losing her, it had all clouded his judgment. In that moment, nothing else mattered. He had acted out of desperation, out of a fear that Amber would leave him. And now, she was gone. The more Mark thought about it, the more he realized how little he had really understood about what was happening. He had been so wrapped up in his own fears and frustrations, in the pressure of trying to hold on to a life that was already slipping through his fingers, that he hadn't seen the truth. He hadn't seen how much Amber had been suffering, how much she had been begging him to listen, to change. His mind would often drift to their conversations, to the arguments they'd had about money, about the future. He remembered her telling him she couldn't do it anymore, that the lies and the stress were too much for her. And yet, he had never really listened. He had pushed her further away, thinking that if he just worked harder, if he just tried harder, it would all fix itself. But it hadn't fixed anything. It had only made things worse. Mark closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. But they kept coming. The faces of her family, the way her mother had looked at him during the trial, the tears in her eyes as she asked how he could do this to her daughter. He had no answer. There was no excuse. He had taken Amber's future. He had destroyed her life. And in doing so, he had destroyed his own. The trial, the verdict, the guilt, it was all just the beginning of his punishment. There was no escaping the truth, no way to undo the damage. And the hardest part was knowing that no matter how long he stayed in this cell, no matter how many days, months, or years passed, Amber would never walk through the door again. Mark stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. He walked to the small barred window in the back of the cell, staring out at the gray sky. The world beyond these walls seemed so distant, so far removed from him now. The man he had been, the man who had once loved Amber, seemed like someone else entirely. In the distance, he could hear the sound of other inmates shouting, laughing, calling to one another. But it all felt so empty to him now. There was no joy, no purpose. There was nothing left but the weight of his actions and the echo of Amber's absence. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty space around him, but the words felt hollow. In the end, the truth was inescapable. The trial had come and gone, but the real sentence had just begun, and Mark knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The years passed slowly, each day dragging by in the dim light of the prison cell. Mark's life had been reduced to this: A routine of meals and long stretches of silence, broken only by the occasional guard or fellow inmate. The outside world had moved on. But for Mark, time had stopped the moment Amber's life was taken. And with it, his own future had been ripped away. Yet as the days turned into months, he found that there was something else he could not escape. Amber's memory, her legacy. It haunted him, yes, but it also pushed him towards something greater than himself, something he hadn't thought possible. In the months after his sentencing, he had learned more about Amber's life, the things he hadn't truly appreciated when she was alive, how her dreams had been bigger than their broken home, how she had wanted to help others, to give back to the world that had shaped her. It was these dreams that had kept her going, even as their relationship faltered. Amber's family, devastated by the loss, had channeled their grief into something meaningful. They had created a foundation in her name, one that supported women who were in abusive relationships, offering them safe places to rebuild their lives. It was something Amber would have wanted, something she had once spoken about, a cause to give her life purpose even in its tragic end. Mark had learned about the foundation through his lawyer. At first, he had felt a sense of detachment, and almost disbelief that Amber's family had found a way to turn their pain into something positive. But as time went on, the truth settled in. This wasn't just about Amber anymore. It was about helping others, preventing them from facing the same fate she had. It was a legacy that now lived beyond the walls of the courtroom. He had heard about the events held in Amber's name, the charity drives, the talks, the survivor stories shared in her honor. It made him sick to his stomach to think that all of this had come from his actions, the terrible price that had been paid. But amidst the pain, there was something else, something he couldn't ignore. It was Amber's legacy, growing and thriving, even though she was gone. One evening, after another long day of reflection, Mark found himself at a small chapel within the prison grounds. It was quiet there, and he had come to cherish the moments of solitude it offered. But this evening was different. For the first time in a long while, he felt a strange sense of resolve settle within him. He knelt before the altar, his hands folded in prayer, but there were no promises to God that he could make. He could never undo what had been done. But there was something he could do, something he hadn't thought of before. Maybe it wouldn't erase the pain or the guilt, but perhaps it would be a way to honor the woman he had so cruelly taken from the world. "I'll do what I can," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. "For you, Amber. I'll make it right, in whatever way I can." And though he had no way of ever bringing her back, of ever taking away the weight of his actions, he could contribute to her cause, to the cause she had cared for. In prison, it would be small steps. Perhaps writing letters, raising awareness, whatever he could offer, he would try. But as Mark stood up, feeling a newfound sense of purpose, it struck him. Amber's legacy was no longer tied to him. She had found her place in the world, a place of giving and love that would carry on, untouched by the darkness of his past. Her memory had become something far more powerful than he could have imagined. It was alive in every woman who found a safe space through the foundation, in every person whose life was touched by her story. Amber was gone, but she wasn't forgotten. Her legacy had outlived the tragedy of her death, and maybe, just maybe, in helping others, Mark could find some semblance of redemption. It was not forgiveness, not an easy way out. But it was a step forward. The guards called time. Pulling Mark back to his cell, he glanced one last time at the chapel, a small flicker of hope rising in his chest. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a beginning. A long road, but a beginning nonetheless. As he walked back through the narrow hallways, the weight of his past still clung to him. But for the first time in a long while, he felt the faintest spark of something else. Something like purpose. Amber's legacy was not defined by how she died, but by the good she had done in her life. And it was her legacy, not his, that would be remembered. What do you think of Mark Creek's actions? Do you believe the financial strain and family tension truly led to such a horrific crime? Or were there other underlying factors? From which region are you watching this video? We would love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, how shocking do you think this story is? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories.